Welcome to another episode of Washington in Focus. I'm your host, Tim Klauser, with the Center Square's Washington State investigative reporter, TJ Martinell, here to talk about a new Supreme Court justice joining the state's high court. Theo Angeles was sworn in earlier this week. TJ Martinell was there, got to speak to some of the other justices about some ongoing drama around the state's new income tax. TJ, why don't you tell us a little bit about your interactions there, especially with Chief Justice Deborah Stevens, given their recent ruling?
Yeah, so I tried to have a conversation with her about a couple of records that I received from the Attorney General's office. I actually got it from the Secretary of State's office, but it was an AGO draft response to Let's Go Washington's lawsuit against the Secretary of State trying to get a referendum on the millionaire's tax. And the millionaire's tax, which was enacted this legislative session, had a necessity clause in it, which was put in there after Solicitor General Noah Purcell suggested it uh, prior to the legislative session in order to prevent a referendum. So in the draft response that the AGO was working on, Carl Smith, who was the Deputy Solicitor General and a former state Supreme Court clerk, he speculated that allowing the people to vote via referendum on the millionaire's tax would be an attractive option for some justices who want to punt on the constitutional question. So I was trying to ask Chief Justice Stevens, what are her thoughts on a former clerk for her court speculating that her court might rule on this issue, not based on case law or legal precedent, but out of political convenience. And I really didn't get a chance to ask that question. And I really didn't get a chance to read what Carl Smith wrote. Um, I think there was initially some confusion about what I was asking her about because she thought I was going to ask her about the ongoing lawsuit that's currently active. So she said she couldn't discuss it. And then I explained, and this is all in the video. You guys can watch. The viewers can go read my story. There's a video of me trying to ask her these questions. So I'm just recounting what happened. And then I said, this is about the lawsuit that was for the referendum, and you have already ruled against it. But then I tried to read what Carl Smith wrote, and she said the opinions of the court speak for themselves and didn't want to discuss it any further. So that's pretty much what my very brief interaction. It didn't help to be honest. It didn't help that that lobby, there was a lot of ambiance and noise and echoing, and there's a lot of marble and stuff like that. So it was difficult to have that conversation, but we did try to have it. For context, I reached out to the state Supreme Court twice when I was working on the initial story because I wanted to discuss it with some of the justices, and I didn't receive a response. So we've definitely tried to get a hold of them to get comment on this matter.
Yeah, and just to clarify for readers a little bit, there's a few different legal challenges going on with the state's new income tax. Now, Let's Go Washington, they had filed an attempt to run a referendum to put it on the ballot for voters, and the state Supreme Court rejected that lawsuit, upholding what they say is years of precedent, saying, look, you can't hold referendums really on tax measures because they're essential for the budget. Now, that lawsuit is separate from another ongoing constitutional challenge in Clickitat County that's expected to reach the court in the next year or so. Where they will rule on the constitutional issues of the income tax. Now, there is an initiative effort underway, so we could still see this on a future ballot. But what really matters is going to be who's ruling over the constitutional issues of this, whether or not it's on the ballot, and where those parties might be aligned. Now, not yesterday, earlier this week, TJ, you were there
Right.
when you talked to Stevens. It was following the swearing in of Theo Angeles. He was appointed by the governor a few months ago, and notably, he worked with the governor at K&L Gates, a law firm that has active contracts with the Attorney General's office. It was years ago, but they did work together. Notably, Colleen Medley used to work under Governor Ferguson when he was the Attorney General at the time. Can you kind of talk about this close-knit group and
Yeah.
the potential concerns of having people that worked for the governor, under the governor, who are donating to the governor's campaigns? What kind of issues that raises when these people will also rule on a potentially unconstitutional tax that the governor heavily endorsed?
Yeah, it's actually kind of amazing, and I didn't fully realize this at the time when I was attending the ceremony. I was a little surprised to see Jamie Peterson there, who Carlene Johnson, our colleague, spoke to and did a story on her conversation with him. Jamie Peterson's the prime sponsor of the millionaire's tax, and he openly said in emails in the stories I've written about that he wanted to force the court to take up the constitutional question of whether income is property. Courts have always said yes. That means no progressive income tax. I wanted to ask Justice Stevens about that. Just say, a couple feet away from you is a state senator who wants to force your court to take up a constitutional issue. You're a separate branch of government. You're an elected official. How do you feel about a elected official from a separate branch of government trying to force yours to do something in that way? And I obviously just didn't get a chance to talk to her about that. And but here's where we have to break it down. So the reason I'm assuming the reason why Senator Peterson was there is because he also worked with Theo Angelis at the same law firm as Governor Ferguson. And Coley Melody was hired by Governor Ferguson, I think back in 2015 for the Attorney General's office. So this is somebody who was directly hired by the governor. On top of that, I did a story on how Coley Melody met with Senator Peterson back in September for reasons that the Attorney General's office says was unrelated to millionaire's tax. But again, she was an attorney meeting with her client because the Attorney General's office has argued that they are the attorney for legislators, even though the Senate and House have their own legal counsel. That argument has been used to redact public records that I've requested of communications between them, which makes it really interesting how I got that 988 pages of unredacted communications in that regard. So that's the level of connection between all these different people where there's what many people could argue is a conflict of interest. So having Coley Melody, who used to work on the Attorney General, used to work for the Attorney General's office. She met with Senator Peterson. He's a former client of hers. He is the prime sponsor of millionaire's tax that is now currently facing a lawsuit where she could be potentially ruling on it. And then you had Theo Angelis, who used to work with the prime sponsor and could also be ruling on that. And he worked with Governor Ferguson, who also had his own income tax proposal that he was looking at this session. So it's a very interesting to see the different connections between them. And so, that's kind of that's the context of in which this ceremony occurred. But that's we'll see what happens moving forward, because the big question that we're going to have to ask is does Justice Angelis and does Justice Melody, do they plan to recuse themselves to avoid an appearance of conflict of interest? Because from what I understand, judicial rules of professional conduct, and I don't know if I get the term on that exact term correctly, but they have to avoid an appearance of a conflict of interest. It's not just a actual conflict of interest, just to avoid it. And so the question is, if they're not going to recuse themselves, what are they going to say to people who think that they have been, that they cannot rule over this impartially?
Yeah, in that judicial rule that you're talking about, it does leave it up to the justices themselves to recuse themselves. They have to recognize the conflict of interest and recuse themselves. It's not a decision made by an outside body to recuse a certain justice. But going back to the Peterson interview at the swearing-in ceremony, I found it particularly interesting that he said, of course, we're state lawmakers. We're consulting with lawyers. Wouldn't the voters want us to consult with lawyers? But the thing here is that the House and Senate, they have their own lawyers.
Right.
The Attorney General's office is the people's lawyer. They represent the state of Washington, the voters of Washington. And state law says that income is property and that you can't have progressive income taxes like this. Yet you have the AGO, who's supposed to be working for the people, working behind the scenes with state lawmakers to force the court to overturn this nearly 100 years of precedent. It's somewhat alarming to hear him say over and over again, well, we're just consulting with lawyers. Wouldn't you want us to do this? But they have their own lawyers. They're consulting with the people's lawyer.
I think that the difference is, and this is what's very interesting, because I have the emails between the governor's office and the Attorney General's office, and they even noted that Governor Ferguson's office was asking very different questions about to the attorney general's office, and the attorney general's office's personnel were noting, they said, because Peterson was saying, I want to get to write a bill that will force the court to take up this 1933 court decision. Governor Ferguson's personnel were saying, hey, we're looking at a potential millionaire's tax or high income earner tax, and we want to get a legal memo as to whether it would survive a court ruling. So they're asking a very different question. They're asking, would this survive a court challenge? Would this pass legal scrutiny? So they weren't, the governor's office, the people with the governor's office was not asking, how do we overturn Colleton? They were asking whether or not it would survive a legal challenge. And so that's the difference between that. That's what you would think a normal elected official or someone who's proposing legislation would say is, hey, I'm interested in this law. Would it survive a legal challenge? And then you go consult with your lawyer, or your lawyer says yes or no, maybe, because they also consulted with the governor's office, consulted with the attorney general's office on the wealth tax that was proposed last year. And so they were looking at, here's all the different areas where it could have legal problems and stuff like that. So that's very different from saying, I want to craft a bill whose primary purpose is to overturn 100 years of legal precedent, and has enormous implications, because if this legal precedent since 1933 is overturned, it means that the legislature can enact a progressive income tax on all Washington residents at any rate, with a simple majority vote. I mean, like, look no further than the estate tax. You have a graduated estate tax where the highest rate was 35%. I mean, you could have a very, very high progressive income tax for high income earners, or they could set any rate they want. They could set 10%, they could set 15%, they could set 20%. They could do whatever they want. And so that's where him going to the attorney general's office saying, I want to, and prior to this, and as a result of these rulings, they would have to go to the voters and go get 2/3 majority of the legislature and 2/3 majority of voters to approve a constitutional amendment to allow a progressive income tax. So instead of going to voters, and this is the part that's it goes back to what Carl Smith said in his draft thing, where he's thought that justices might want to allow referendum. What he's basically saying, and what obviously Noah Purcell was insinuating in his recommendation to have a necessity or emergency clause, is if this gets in front of voters, voters will say no. And this is the question, and I think Senator Peterson's been asked this question, and I don't think he really answered it, is why not allow voters to weigh in on this via referendum? And, he mentions that the initiative process, but the initiative process is very different from from a referendum. There's a whole set of different things that occur, and people are trying to get. I think it's Let's Go Washington is trying to get the initiative on the ballot for this year, but that's a very different process, and it gives the attorney general's office more control. The same people who crafted the bill to overturn a court decision are now going to get to write the title for the ballot measure. So, and there's already, I think, a legal challenge going on over that, if I recall correctly. So that's the difference between Governor Ferguson's people going to the attorney general's office and saying, we want to look at a high income earner tax. We want to get your opinion on whether it would survive a legal challenge. So we can assume that the purpose of the tax was just to levy a tax on high income earners rather than overturn a court decision. So that's really the question to be asked, is how often has the attorney general's office actively collaborated with a lawmaker to get and it's not just, Senator Peterson keeps talking about Colleton as if it's the Supreme Court has only weighed in on this issue once 100 years ago, and that's it. The Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled that income is property. I think it was in 1960, the state Supreme Court said it is no longer a question to this court whether income is property. So they're effectively saying, we're done talking about this, and and of course, courts can always go back on prior decisions, but they have a really high bar. The attorney general's office even admitted in their legal memo to the governor's office, if they were to overturn this, they would have to prove that 90 something years worth of legal precedent was harmful and erroneous. And that's a high bar for them. So this goes back to, the appointment of Angelus and Melody is are they going to take that? Is that going to apply? Is that going to be the basis of how they do their ruling if this ever gets in front of the state Supreme Court?
Yeah, it'd definitely be interesting to see how that decision eventually comes out with this close knit circle. I mean, it was glaringly obvious when you were in the Supreme Court chambers earlier this week, where you had the drafters of the bill, the people that will be fighting on its behalf, the AGO in court, and then the Supreme Court
Sure.
justices all in one place. But TJ, definitely a story that we'll continue to cover, and we appreciate your coverage of this. For readers hoping to catch that story, you can read it at thecentersquare.com. Otherwise, thank you for joining us for another episode of Washington in Focus.